And another example, also from 1890, in the 15th Assembly District, we have some more examples of using these records of the city directory, the city record, voter supplement, and then the any vital records or census records that may have occurred that year. And one thing to remember is that apartment dwellers in the 19th century urban centers were often enticed to move by the promise of a free month's rent or a freshly painted apartment. Therefore, our urban ancestors may have been very transient and often difficult to track. The above resources will be key to finding one's urban ancestors across the decades. If an ancestor was positively identified on a specific date living at a specific address, there is a great likelihood that he was at that same address weeks or months before and after for a check in the census or voter rolls. One can utilize these record sets to pinpoint a likely location for the ancestor on a specific date. Again, work from known to unknowns is a common suggestion in family history research. Sometimes researchers do not realize how much they actually already know or could reasonably discover. A thorough use of the above mentioned sources often leads to research success. Certain record sets were regularly collected. The federal census was collected every 10 years, beginning in 1790. Voter registrations and records of actual voting were created regularly in autumn pursuant to November elections. City directory information was collected and printed by the publisher almost every year. Other records, such as birth, death, and marriage certificates, along with sacramental and burial registrations, were created differently. They were created throughout the calendar year with no regularity because a specific event had occurred, necessitating registration and documentation. Looking at these two types of records together can benefit the researcher and produce answers to nagging questions. Trying to find when they are proximate to each other in the calendar year can be a productive game plan. So again, in the fall of 1890, we know that New York City takes a police census from the later weeks of September to the earlier weeks of October, and then just a couple weeks later, they're going to run this voter list. So there's a good chance that you can use the two to find the person in the census if you had trouble. And there next to the key, we see Owen Goodwin, who's living at 556 West 38th Street. He's in the 15th Assembly District in the 21st Election Division. And it should be simple to therefore go to that address in the police census and find him. And when I did see the other people, listed as voters, were listed on the enumeration for the police census, but Owen is not there. So I do not know when he moved in or moved out, but I do know that, the day of the census, he may have been leery of the police, or he may not have been home, or he may have moved on to other places. But on the 29th of October, I know he was registered to vote at that address. And then just a few weeks earlier, he does not show up present in the police census. So again, I did my due diligence with trying to my best to find him. Now, in the 17th Assembly District, there are a couple of men that are misidentified, ironically. The first one is here next to the key at 647, Hugh Goodman, which is actually Hugh Goodwin. And his wife had died a few months earlier, and she dies, if you look in the middle of the certificate, at 647 West 46th Street. So we know that they have not moved, and it's the 22nd Ward. And she died from cold and pneumonia. She was 47 years of age, and the record was registered on the 31st of March. So this is about 6 months earlier. But then we are able to find at that same address, just before the registration of voting, we find at 647 West 46th Street, Hugh Goodwin. He's 50. He's living with a male, Peter, 14, and a female, Sarah, she's 11. And that, according to their baptismal certificates, Those two are the children of Hugh Goodwin and the late Ellen O'Brien Goodwin. So you see that we're able to track them. Now in the city directory, that's good supposedly through May 1st of 1890, Hugh Goodwin has formerly lived at 520 West 39th Street. Well, obviously by March of 1890, they moved. And then in October, November for the voting, they were at 647 of 1889. So the previous year, he was at 647 West 46th Street in the Assembly District 17 in the Election Division 7. And then, the following spring came and Ellen had died. And then in the fall, he and his children are surviving her and identified in the police census. And then on the 29th of October, he's still registered to vote, although the address is now in a different election division. But again, this is a good way to, since we know there's a variety of both civil and vital records taking place, there's also both of the children were confirmed in the Catholic Church of St. Raphael's in this time period a few weeks after their mother died. So again, you're able to tie it all together based on their locality. Now, on the 6th of July in 1890, a man named Peter Goodwin resided at 422 West 48th Street, according to his marriage registration at St. Paul the Apostle. And the key, it's the top entry on the page, and the key is pointing it out. His bride's name is Mary Cunningham, and the address is listed on the right page, 422 West 48th Street. So had the federal census survived, one would assume that just 4 weeks earlier, on June 2nd, when the census was supposedly taken, that's the day, that was the census day. Now, obviously, the enumerators arrived days later, but they were supposed to record whatever was accurate as of June 2nd. So hypothetically, that's where Peter would have lived. Had that census survived, we could substantiate that, but it doesn't survive. But what does survive is Peter was a naturalized citizen as of 1888, so he was a voter, and we're able to find him. He's in the 17th Assembly District, as was Hugh, and there we see him at 546 next to the key Peter Goodwin, W-E-N instead of W-I-N. Remember, spelling is not standard. Peter could not read and write, so it may just be a transcription error or just a spelling error on the behalf of whoever the official was that recorded this list. But at 546 West 46th Street, so it's just a block or so away from Hugh Goodwin, is Peter Goodwin is living. And we know that he voted, or at least registered to vote, as of October 29th, 1890. And a couple weeks earlier, the census taker would have come to that address, and the key points out that when he got there, he found a Peter Goodwin, age 30, male, living with a Mary Goodwin, female, age 25. And we know from the marriage record that her name was Mary Cunningham, so this is the couple living as a married couple. Hypothetically, Mary Cunningham may have died, and this could be Peter's sister or a former sister-in-law or a new wife. But to put that to rest, we do see that a few months later, 8 months later, in July of 1891, a male child is born to Peter Goodwin and Mary Goodwin of 546 West 46th Street. So we know for certain that the Mary Goodwin, did survive. I guess we never really know it since she's not identified as wife in that police census. They may have had a fight and she was spending the night elsewhere, and that was his sister or sister-in-law. But here we're able to tie it together that they're staying in that specific apartment building for several months, and they probably moved in there after their marriage. So on June 2nd, 1890, the federal census was taken, and that census was later lost to fire and water damage and ultimately ordered destroyed by an act of Congress in 1933. On July 6, 1890, the church marriage record says that Peter lived at 422 West 48th Street. In September, October of 1890, the police census has him at 546 West 46th Street. His registration to vote has him there at the end of October as well. Then the following city directory year that began on May 2nd to 1891 to May 1st of 1891, it shows him as Peter Goodwin, driver, at that address. That's page 511. I chose not to make subsequent copies since they were very difficult to read and therefore not worth the trouble of digging them up again and screenshotting images. And on July 23rd, 1891, Male Goodwin was born at that address to Peter and Mary. The baby's name was Owen Goodwin, and he was baptized a few days later at the Church of the Holy Cross in that neighborhood as well, as they were Catholic, so it's not surprising. And then that following fall, on the 28th of October, 1891, he was listed as being registered to vote again at 546 West 46th Street. So this is a way of trying to triangulate the various records that exist across your across the years. Take a 12 to 15-month period where you know a few. They're in a census. They're in a city directory. They're on a birth record or a marriage record, and you do know more than you sometimes realize. So I hope that this gives you some ideas and some enthusiasm for future research.